On a fog-shrouded October morning in 1953, seminarian Michael Hartwell vanished from his locked dormitory room at St. Ignatius Seminary in the remote mountains of northern Vermont, leaving behind only a blood-stained rosary and a desperate note, scrawled in Latin that read, "They are not teaching us to serve God. The faculty serves another master entirely." For over 70 years, the Catholic Church has kept the true circumstances of his disappearance buried in Vatican archives. But recently discovered letters reveal a conspiracy so disturbing that it threatened to shake the very foundations of American Catholicism. What happened to the young man who had dreamed of ministering to the poor was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The investigation that followed was deliberately suppressed. Witnesses were transferred to distant parishes or mysteriously died, and evidence was systematically destroyed by some of the Church's most powerful bishops. Before we continue with the story of Michael Hartwell and the dark secrets that consumed St. Ignatius Seminary, subscribe to our channel and leave comment telling us what state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across America. The stories we uncover often hit closer to home than you might expect. The truth about that misty October evening would expose a web of corruption, forbidden knowledge, and spiritual perversion that reached into the highest levels of the Catholic hierarchy, involving seminary professors, diocesan bishops, and Vatican officials whose names were spoken in reverent whispers throughout. CatholicAmerica.St. Ignatius Seminary stood like a medieval fortress in the Green Mountains of Vermont, its Gothic towers piercing the perpetual mist that shrouded the valley like a burial shroud. Built in 1847 with funds donated by Irish immigrants who had scraped together their life savings to create a place where American boys could train for the priesthood, the seminary had produced some of the most influential clergymen in the country. Cardinals, bishops, and renowned theologians had walked its stone corridors and knelt in its ancient chapel, their prayers rising with the incense toward heaven. The seminary's isolation was deliberate. Nestled in a valley accessible only by a single winding mountain road, it provided the perfect environment for spiritual contemplation and academic rigor. The nearest town, Millbrook, lay 15 miles down treacherous mountain passes, a journey that took nearly an hour in good weather and was impassable during Vermont's brutal winters. This isolation meant that seminarians could focus entirely on their studies and spiritual development, free from the distractions and temptations of the modern world. The building itself was a masterpiece of Gothic revival architecture. Massive stone walls rose 4 stories high, punctuated by narrow windows that cast long shadows across the interior corridors even during the brightest days. The chapel occupied the building's heart, its vaulted ceilings soaring 60 feet above marble, floors worn smooth by decades of genuflection. Stained glass windows depicting the lives of saints bathed the interior in jeweled light that seemed to dance with otherworldly beauty during morning prayers. The seminary's library contained over 100,000 volumes, including some of the rarest theological texts in North America. Ancient manuscripts in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew filled climate-controlled vaults beneath the main floor, available only to advanced students and faculty members who had proven their scholarly dedication. The collection included works that even Vatican scholars consulted, drawing visiting experts from universities across Europe and America. In 1953, St. Ignatius housed 47 seminarians, ranging from first-year philosophy students to fourth-year theologians preparing for ordination. These young men came from every corner of America, united by their calling to serve God and their commitment to the intellectual and spiritual discipline required for priesthood. They followed a rigorous schedule that began with lauds at 5:30 a.m. and concluded with Compline at 9 p.m. Their days structured around prayer, study, manual labor, and meditation. The faculty consisted of 12 priests, each a specialist in his field and carefully selected for both academic excellence and spiritual maturity. Father Superior Augustine Blackwood had led the seminary for 15 years, his reputation for theological scholarship matched only by his fierce dedication to producing priests worthy of their sacred calling. Under his leadership, St. Ignatius had gained recognition as one of the most academically rigorous seminaries in North America. Father Thomas Meridian taught systematic theology with a brilliance that left his students both enlightened and intimidated. His lectures on the nature of divine grace and the mechanics of salvation drew visitors from other seminaries, and his published works were standard texts in Catholic universities throughout the country. Students considered themselves privileged to study under a man whose theological insights were regularly consulted by bishops and Vatican officials. Father Sebastian Carver, the professor of church history, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of ecclesiastical development from the apostolic age through the modern era. His ability to connect historical patterns with contemporary theological questions made his classes essential preparation for any seminarian hoping to navigate the complex realities of 20th century pastoral work. Father Nicholas Wolfram taught philosophy with a precision that revealed the logical foundations underlying Catholic doctrine. His courses in metaphysics and epistemology were legendary for their intellectual rigor, preparing seminarians to defend their faith against the sophisticated attacks of modern secularism. But it was Father Heinrich Voss, the newest addition to the faculty, who would prove to be the most significant figure in the events that unfolded during the fall of 1953. Voss had arrived just 6 months earlier, carrying impeccable credentials from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome and bearing letters of recommendation from some of the Vatican's most influential theologians. His specialty was described as advanced sacramental theology, a field so specialized that few American seminaries offered instruction in its deeper mysteries. At 42, Father Voss possessed an otherworldly quality that made him simultaneously magnetic and unsettling. Tall and gaunt, with prematurely white hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see through the physical world into realms beyond human understanding, he spoke with a soft German accent that lent authority to even his most casual observations. His knowledge of ancient languages was extraordinary, including dialects of Aramaic and Hebrew that even Hebrew university scholars found obscure. Michael Hartwell had arrived at St. Ignatius in September 1950, an earnest young man from Boston, whose calling to the priesthood had manifested during his senior year at Boston College. The son of Irish immigrants who had built a small but successful construction business, Michael possessed the combination of intellectual curiosity and spiritual sensitivity that marked him as exceptional seminary material. His undergraduate professors had described him as one of the most promising candidates for priestly formation they had ever encountered. At 25, Michael was older than most first-year seminarians, having spent 2 years after college working in his father's business while discerning his vocation. This maturity served him well in adapting to seminary life, and he quickly established himself as both a serious student and a natural leader among his peers. His academic performance was consistently excellent, and his spiritual development impressed even the most demanding faculty members. Michael's letters home to his parents revealed a young man deeply committed to his calling, but increasingly troubled by aspects of his theological education that he struggled to understand. His father, Patrick Hartwell, had preserved these letters for decades, and they provide a window into the progressive corruption of an innocent soul drawn into circumstances beyond his comprehension. In a letter dated November 15, 1952, Michael wrote, "The studies grow more complex as we advance, dear Father. Professor Voss has selected several of us for advanced instruction in what he calls the deeper mysteries of sacramental theology. I confess that some of the texts we're studying seem to contain ideas that trouble my conscience, but Professor Voss assures us that understanding these concepts is essential for any priest who hopes to minister effectively in our modern age. Pray for me that I might have the wisdom to discern truth from error in these difficult matters." By spring 1953, Michael's letters had taken on a more disturbing tone that revealed growing anxiety about his theological studies. "The advanced seminars have introduced concepts that seem to contradict everything I learned during my first years here," he wrote in March. Professor Voss speaks of spiritual techniques that promise direct communion with divine power, but the practices he describes feel dangerous to my soul. When I expressed my concerns to other faculty members, they assured me that Professor Voss's instruction represents the cutting edge of Catholic theology, approved by the highest authorities in Rome. Yet something within me rebels against these teachings. The summer of 1953 had been particularly intense for the advanced seminarians. Instead of returning home for the traditional summer break, 12 students, including Michael, had remained at St. Ignatius for what was described as an intensive seminar in mystical theology and advanced pastoral techniques. The program was conducted entirely by Father Voss, with minimal oversight from other faculty members, who were either away on sabbatical or engaged in their own summer research projects. During these summer sessions, isolated from their families and fellow seminarians, the 12 participants were introduced to practices and concepts that would have shocked even liberal Catholic theologians. Father Voss claimed to be sharing knowledge that had been carefully guarded by the Church for centuries, available only to those deemed worthy of such profound spiritual instruction. The seminarians were required to sign agreements pledging absolute secrecy about their summer studies, with Voss explaining that premature revelation of these teachings to unprepared minds could cause spiritual damage or scandal. The students were told that they had been selected for this honor based on their exceptional spiritual maturity and intellectual capabilities, and that their future effectiveness as priests depended on mastering these advanced techniques. Brother Timothy Morrison, who served as the seminary's groundskeeper and had worked at St. Ignatius for over 20 years, noticed disturbing changes in the summer seminar participants. In a letter to his sister in Burlington, he wrote, "The young men studying with the new professor have become strange, Sister Mary Catherine. They move like sleepwalkers during the day and gather in the chapel at hours when they think no one is watching. Their prayers sound different, not like the Latin we've always used, but in languages that make my skin crawl just to hear them. I've asked Father Superior about it, but he tells me that advanced theological study naturally changes young men, preparing them for the profound responsibilities of priesthood. Still, I cannot shake the feeling that something unholy has entered our blessed seminary." The fall semester of 1953 began with Father Voss announcing the formation of an even more exclusive group within the advanced seminar students. He selected only 5 seminarians for what he called final preparation for ordination into the fullness of priestly power. Michael Hartwell was among the chosen 5, along with seminarians Robert Chun from San Francisco, David Kowalski from Chicago, James Murphy from Philadelphia, and Thomas Anderson from Minneapolis. These 5 young men were given access to the seminary's most restricted archives, including manuscripts that even visiting scholars were not permitted to examine. They studied in a specially prepared room in the library's basement, a chamber that had been sealed for decades until Father Voss requested permission to use it for his advanced instruction. The room's stone walls were covered with symbols that Voss claimed were ancient Christian mystical signs, though several seminarians privately noted that the markings bore no resemblance to traditional Catholic iconography. Father Voss's instruction during this final phase focused on what he described as sacramental transcendence, the ability of properly prepared priests to channel divine power directly through their own spiritual essence, rather than merely serving as conduits for grace, administered through traditional sacramental forms. He taught that certain ancient Christian communities had possessed this knowledge, but that it had been suppressed by institutional authorities, who feared its revolutionary implications for church structure and papal authority. The techniques Voss taught involved meditation practices, dietary restrictions, and ritual observances that grew increasingly elaborate and disturbing as the semester progressed. Students were required to fast for extended periods, consuming only specially prepared substances that Voss claimed would purify their spiritual essence and prepare them for direct divine communion. They participated in midnight ceremonies in the sealed basement room, rituals that combined elements of traditional Catholic liturgy with practices that seemed drawn from much older and darker sources. Michael's final letters home revealed a young man trapped between his desire to serve God faithfully and his growing recognition that something fundamentally wrong was occurring at St. Ignatius. In a letter dated October 10, 1953, he wrote, "Dear Father, I fear I have been deceived about the nature of my calling. The instruction I am receiving no longer feels like preparation for Catholic priesthood, but rather induction into something that opposes everything Christ taught. Yet Professor Voss assures us that we are being prepared for a form of ministry that will revolutionize the Church and bring about a new age of spiritual power on earth. I am torn between my desire to serve God and my growing conviction that we are being led away from, rather than toward, divine truth. Pray for me, dear Father, that God might grant me the courage to choose righteousness, whatever the cost." October 20th, 1953, dawned gray and cold, with early winter fog rolling down from the mountain peaks to settle over St. Ignatius Seminary like a premature shroud. The temperature had dropped below freezing during the night, and ice crystals formed intricate patterns on the Gothic windows, creating an otherworldly beauty that seemed to mock the darkness gathering within the ancient walls. Michael had spent a restless night, tormented by dreams that felt more like visions of the spiritual corruption he was being asked to embrace. He had awakened before dawn, his sheets soaked with perspiration despite the cold, and had knelt beside his narrow dormitory bed for nearly an hour, praying desperately for guidance and strength to resist whatever final ceremony Professor Voss had planned for that evening. Throughout the day, Michael attended his regular classes, but his fellow seminarians noticed his distraction and growing agitation. During morning prayer, he had remained kneeling long after the others had risen, his lips moving in what appeared to be urgent supplication. At meals, he barely touched his food, and during study periods, he was observed staring out windows with an expression of profound anguish. Brother Morrison, making his usual rounds of the building, encountered Michael in the library during the afternoon and was shocked by the young man's appearance. His usually healthy complexion had become pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes, suggesting weeks of inadequate sleep. Most disturbing were his eyes themselves, which had acquired a haunted quality that Brother Morrison had seen only in men who had witnessed unspeakable horrors during the war. "Are you well, my son?" Brother Morrison asked, his voice filled with genuine concern for a young man he had watched develop from an eager first-year student into a promising candidate for ordination. Michael looked up from the theology text he had been staring at without reading, his eyes focusing with difficulty on the kindly brother's face. "I fear I am far from well, Brother Morrison. I fear that none of us are well, and that our sickness may be beyond any earthly cure." His voice carried a tremor that made the older man's blood chill, and his words seemed carefully chosen to convey warning without violating whatever vows of secrecy bound his tongue. As evening approached, the 5 members of Professor Voss's inner circle received summons to gather in the basement chamber at 11:30 p.m. for what was described as their final preparation for ordination into the mysteries. The message, delivered by a first-year seminarian who seemed nervous about his errand, specified that they should come fasting and prepared for a ceremony that would fundamentally transform their relationship with the divine. At 10:45 p.m., Michael made a decision that would save his soul but cost him everything else. Instead of proceeding to the basement chamber as instructed, he went to his dormitory room and carefully composed a letter that he hoped would serve as both confession and warning. Using his fountain pen and his finest penmanship, he wrote, "To whoever may find this letter, I, Michael Patrick Hartwell, seminarian of the 4th year at St. Ignatius Seminary, do hereby testify that the instruction being conducted by Professor Heinrich Voss is not Catholic theology, but rather induction into practices that oppose the gospel of Jesus Christ. Under the guise of advanced sacramental preparation, he has been teaching 5 of us techniques and rituals that promise spiritual power through communion with forces that are decidedly not divine. Tonight, we are to undergo a final ceremony that Professor Voss claims will grant us abilities beyond those of ordinary priests, but I now understand will actually bind our souls to whatever dark master he truly serves. I cannot participate in this blasphemy, though my refusal may cost me my life. If anything happens to me, know that Professor Voss is not what he appears to be, and that the Church must be warned about the corruption he has brought to this holy place. May God forgive my weakness in allowing myself to be deceived for so long, and may he protect those who come after from the spiritual poison that has infected St. Ignatius Seminary. Signed in the name of Jesus Christ, Michael Patrick Hartwell, October 20th, 1953. Michael sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it beneath his mattress, hoping it would be discovered if he failed to return from whatever confrontation awaited him. He then removed his rosary from his desk drawer, clutching the blessed beads as he prepared to face Professor Voss and refuse participation in whatever ceremony had been planned at 11:25 p.m. Instead of proceeding to the basement chamber, Michael made his way to Father Superior Blackwood's private quarters. The corridors were empty and dark, lit only by dim electric bulbs that cast long shadows across the stone floors. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the Gothic spaces, and the sound seemed to carry an ominous weight that made him quicken his pace. He knocked softly on Father Superior's door, then more urgently when there was no immediate response. After several minutes, Father Blackwood appeared in his nightgown, his face showing irritation at being awakened that quickly changed to concern when he saw Michael's distressed state. "My son, what brings you to my door at this ungodly hour? Are you ill? Do you require medical attention?" Michael's words came in a rush, his carefully maintained composure finally breaking under the weight of months of accumulated horror. "Father Superior, I must speak with you about Professor Voss and the instruction he has been providing to myself and 4 other seminarians. What he is teaching is not Catholic theology, but something far darker. Tonight, he plans to conduct a ceremony that I believe will complete our spiritual corruption. I cannot participate, and I fear for the souls of my fellow seminarians who may not have the strength to resist." Father Blackwood's expression grew troubled as he listened to Michael's account, but his response revealed that the corruption at St. Ignatius extended far beyond Professor Voss alone. Instead of expressing alarm or promising immediate investigation, he placed a fatherly hand on Michael's shoulder and spoke in the gentle but firm tone used to redirect troubled young men whose scruples had overcome their judgment. "My dear Michael, I understand that Professor Voss's instruction can seem challenging to those unprepared for advanced theological concepts, but I want to assure you that his work here has the full approval of the highest church authorities. The techniques he teaches represent the cutting edge of Catholic mystical theology, developed by scholars at the Vatican who understand spiritual realities far beyond what we encounter in standard seminary education. Your feelings of unease are natural and even praiseworthy, showing that you take seriously the sacred nature of what you are learning. But you must trust in the wisdom of your superiors and the guidance of the Holy Spirit working through established church authority." Michael's heart sank as he realized that Father Superior was either deceived about Professor Voss's true nature or, more horrifying still, was complicit in whatever corruption had infected the seminary. His voice barely above a whisper, he made one final appeal. Father Superior, I beg you to examine the texts we have been studying and to observe the ceremonies Professor Voss conducts. What he is teaching contradicts fundamental Catholic doctrine and promotes practices that no Christian should embrace. If you will not investigate, then I must refuse to participate further and request immediate transfer to another seminary. Father. Blackwood's paternal demeanor hardened into something far less benevolent as he realized that Michael would not be easily redirected or controlled. I'm afraid that's not possible, my son. Your advanced instruction represents a significant investment by the Church, and there are obligations that bind you to complete what has been begun. Professor Voss has explained to me that the final stages of this program require the participation of all 5 selected seminarians. Your withdrawal would not only forfeit your own spiritual advancement, but would also damage the development of your fellow students. I must insist that you fulfill your obligations and trust in the wisdom of your superiors. The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had corrupted St. Ignatius Seminary. Father Superior admitted that Professor Voss's program had been specifically requested by cardinal authorities in Rome, though he claimed not to know the details of these high-level communications. He explained that the 5 seminarians had been selected not just for their academic abilities, but for specific spiritual characteristics that made them suitable for advanced formation in mystical theology. As Michael pressed for more information, Father Blackwood revealed that similar programs were being conducted at seminaries throughout the United States, all under the direction of specially trained instructors who reported directly to Vatican offices that operated independently of normal diocesan authority. The young men selected for these programs were being prepared for a form of ministry that would be crucial to the Church's mission in the modern world, though the exact nature of this mission remained classified at the highest levels of Church hierarchy. The Church faces unprecedented challenges in the 20th century, Father Blackwood explained, his voice taking on the tone of a man sharing sacred secrets. Secularism, communism, and materialism threaten to destroy Christian civilization. The traditional methods of evangelization and pastoral care are proving inadequate against these sophisticated attacks on faith. The Holy Father himself has authorized the development of new approaches to spiritual warfare, techniques that will enable specially prepared priests to combat evil with power that matches the intensity of modern threats to the Church. Michael's theological training enabled him to recognize the fundamental errors in Father Superior's reasoning, but his spiritual sensitivity allowed him to perceive something even more disturbing. The older priest's words carried an underlying resonance that seemed to originate from sources other than Catholic tradition. His references to spiritual warfare and combating evil with power echoed concepts found in occult literature rather than Orthodox Christian theology. As midnight approached, Father Blackwood informed Michael that his presence was required in the basement chamber regardless of his personal reservations. Professor Voss has explained to me that the ceremony scheduled for tonight represents the culmination of 2 years of careful preparation. The spiritual energies that have been invoked cannot be safely dispersed without the participation of all 5 designated seminarians. Your refusal to participate would not only forfeit your own advancement, but could result in spiritual harm to your fellow students and even to the seminary community as a whole. Michael's request to contact his parents or his home diocese was denied, with Father Superior explaining that communication about the advanced program was strictly controlled to prevent misunderstanding by those not prepared to comprehend its sacred nature. He was essentially a prisoner, bound by vows of obedience to superiors who had revealed themselves to be either deceived or corrupted. At 11:55 p.m., Father Blackwood personally escorted Michael to the basement chamber, his hand firmly gripping the young seminarian's arm to prevent any possibility of escape. As they descended the stone steps that led beneath the library, the temperature seemed to drop with each level, and the air grew thick with an oppressive presence that made breathing difficult. The basement chamber had been transformed since Michael's last visit into something that bore no resemblance to any Christian sacred space. The stone walls were now covered with symbols carved directly into the rock, markings that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering candlelight. The familiar crucifix had been replaced by an altar constructed from black stone, its surface stained with substances that Michael preferred not to identify. Professor Voss stood before the altar, dressed in robes that combined elements of traditional Catholic vestments with decorations that originated from much older and darker traditions. His pale blue eyes seemed to glow with an inner light as he surveyed the 5 seminarians who had been assembled for the final ceremony. The other 4 young men stood in positions around the chamber, their faces showing the glazed expression of those whose wills had been systematically broken down and rebuilt according to another's design. "Welcome, Brother Michael," Professor Voss said, his soft German accent lending a sinister quality to words that should have conveyed Christian fellowship. "Tonight, you and your fellow seminarians will undergo the final preparation for your true ordination. You will be transformed from mere students of theology into wielders of spiritual power, capable of commanding forces that ordinary priests can only petition through prayer." The ceremony that followed combined elements of Catholic ritual with practices drawn from traditions that predated Christianity by centuries. Professor Voss directed the seminarians to positions around the black altar, each standing at a point marked by symbols that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. He then began reciting what sounded like a perverted version of the ordination ritual, but with invocations addressed to entities whose names made the stone chamber seem to tremble with supernatural dread. As the ceremony progressed, Michael realized with growing horror that he and his fellow seminarians were not being ordained as Catholic priests, but rather as ministers of whatever dark power Professor Voss truly served. The advanced sacramental theology they had been studying was actually instruction in techniques for channeling spiritual forces that opposed everything Christian faith represented. Just before we reveal what happened to Michael during that terrifying ceremony, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest mysteries. Leave a comment below telling us about any strange experiences you've had in religious buildings. Sometimes the most sacred places hide the most unholy secrets. The climax of the ceremony came when Professor Voss produced a chalice carved from what appeared to be black obsidian and filled it with a substance that definitely was not wine. Each seminarian was required to drink from the cup while swearing an oath of eternal service to the true master of spiritual power. The other 4 young men complied without hesitation, their wills having been systematically broken down over months of psychological manipulation and gradual spiritual corruption. When the chalice was offered to Michael, he made the decision that would save his soul but doom his mortal life. Drawing upon reserves of courage he had not known he possessed, he struck the cup from Professor Voss's hands, sending it crashing against the stone wall, where it shattered into fragments that seemed to scream as they hit the floor. "I will not drink from this cup of damnation," Michael declared, his voice ringing through the chamber with the authority of one who had chosen righteousness regardless of consequences. "I serve Jesus Christ, not whatever master you represent. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, I renounce these dark practices and call upon God Almighty to protect me from the evil you would work upon my soul." Professor Voss's reaction revealed the true nature that he had concealed beneath his academic credentials and priestly demeanor. His pale features contorted with rage that seemed supernatural in its intensity, and his voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. You foolish boy, do you imagine that your pitiful faith can protect you from powers that ruled this earth before your Christ was even conceived? You have participated in our preparations, consumed our offerings, and sworn preliminary oaths that bind your soul regardless of your final decision. You cannot escape what you have already become. The confrontation that followed tested Michael's faith in ways that no seminary training could have prepared him for. Professor Voss revealed himself to be something far more dangerous than a heretical priest or occult practitioner. The supernatural displays of power he commanded, the way shadows seemed to bend to his will, and the inhuman knowledge he demonstrated made it clear that Michael was facing an enemy that transcended mere human evil. The other 4 seminarians, their wills completely subservient to their master, moved to restrain Michael, while Professor Voss prepared to complete the ceremony by force. But the young man's declaration of faith had somehow altered the spiritual atmosphere of the chamber, and the demonic forces that had previously operated unopposed found their power constrained by the presence of divine protection. Drawing upon everything he had learned during his years of theological study, Michael began reciting prayers of exorcism and spiritual protection. Though he was not yet ordained as a priest, his sincere faith in desperate need gave power to words that might have been mere formalities in other circumstances. The Latin phrases he remembered from his liturgical studies seemed to create a barrier around him that the corrupted seminarians could not cross. Professor Voss, realizing that his carefully orchestrated ceremony was collapsing, made a final desperate attempt to complete the ritual by offering Michael a choice that revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had corrupted St. Ignatius Seminary. He could submit willingly to the final stage of his transformation and be granted power beyond imagination, or he could die in the chamber and be buried beneath the seminary, where his disappearance would be explained as a tragic accident or sudden departure. Your church hierarchy has already been informed of your unstable mental condition and your growing obsession with imaginary conspiracies. Voss sneered, his academic mask finally discarded to reveal something that was barely human. Your death will be ruled a suicide brought on by the spiritual strain of advanced theological study. Your parents will mourn a son who could not bear the weight of his calling. Your fellow seminarians will learn from your example that resistance to proper authority leads only to destruction. But Michael had found a source of strength that transcended his fear of death or concern for his reputation. His years of spiritual formation, despite their recent corruption, had established within him a foundation of faith that could not be destroyed by external manipulation. Standing in that chamber surrounded by enemies both human and supernatural, he experienced a moment of clarity that revealed his true calling. I would rather die as a faithful Christian than live as a servant of darkness, he declared, his voice steady despite the supernatural terror that pressed against him from all sides. Do what you will with my body, but my soul belongs to Jesus Christ, and neither you nor your master can claim it. The final moments of that October night remain shrouded in mystery, for no reliable witness survived to tell the complete story. What is known comes from evidence discovered decades later, and from the testimony of Brother Morrison, who was awakened by sounds of supernatural conflict emanating from beneath the library. Brother Morrison's account, given years later to church. Investigators described hearing what sounded like a tremendous spiritual battle being fought in the seminary's depths. Voices raised in prayers and curses, the sound of stone cracking under supernatural pressure, and most disturbing of all, screams that seemed to come from both human and inhuman sources. The conflict lasted for nearly an hour before ending abruptly, in a silence that felt more ominous than the preceding chaos. When morning came, Michael Hartwell was gone. His dormitory room showed no signs of struggle, but hidden beneath his mattress was the letter he had written, providing the first clue to the true nature of events at St. Ignatius Seminary. The basement chamber or evidence of some kind of violent confrontation, with the black altar cracked down the middle and strange burn marks covering the stone walls. Professor Voss claimed that Michael had suffered a complete mental breakdown during an advanced spiritual exercise and had fled the seminary during the night. The official investigation, conducted by diocesan authorities who had been carefully selected for their willingness to accept convenient explanations, concluded that the young seminarian had left voluntarily due to doubts about his vocation, complicated by psychological instability brought on by the rigors of advanced theological study. The other 4 seminarians who had participated in the ceremony were found the next morning in their beds, apparently unconscious, but showing no signs of physical injury. When they awakened, they claimed to have no memory of the previous night's events or of their months of study with Professor Voss. Medical examination revealed no obvious cause for their amnesia, and psychiatrists concluded that they had suffered some form of collective psychological trauma that their minds had blocked out as a protective mechanism. Dr. Charles Morrison, a Catholic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the affected seminarians, noted in his confidential report that the young men displayed symptoms consistent with severe spiritual trauma. They exhibit behavior patterns suggesting exposure to experiences that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality, he wrote. While they claim no memory of traumatic events, their reactions to religious imagery and their resistance to participating in traditional Catholic practices suggest that something profound and disturbing occurred during their time under Professor Voss's instruction. The 4 seminarians were quietly transferred to different institutions for continued evaluation and treatment. Their seminary careers effectively ended. All 4 would struggle with psychological problems for the remainder of their lives, never able to pursue ordination to the priesthood, despite their apparent recovery from whatever trauma they had experienced. Professor Heinrich Voss disappeared from St. Ignatius Seminary within 48 hours of Michael's vanishing, claiming to have received urgent summons to return to Rome for consultation with Vatican authorities. His departure was so hasty that he left behind personal possessions and academic materials, suggesting that his exit was neither planned nor voluntary. Subsequent investigation revealed that the Vatican had no record of summoning Professor Voss, and that his claimed credentials from the Pontifical Gregorian University were entirely fabricated. The truth about Professor Voss's identity and origins would not be uncovered for several decades, but when it finally emerged, it revealed connections to occult organizations that had been infiltrating Catholic institutions throughout Europe, and America for over a century. His real name was Heinrich Volker, and he was a member of a secretive society that sought to corrupt Catholic seminaries by introducing future priests to practices that would gradually undermine the church from within. Father Superior Augustine Blackwood's role in the conspiracy became clearer through documents discovered after his death in 1967. His private papers revealed correspondence with individuals claiming to represent Vatican offices, but whose communications contained theological errors that should have alerted any competent Catholic educator to their fraudulent nature. Whether Father Blackwood was deceived by these false authorities, or was himself a willing participant in the corruption of St. Ignatius Seminary, remains unclear, but his actions certainly facilitated the infiltration that nearly destroyed the institution. In the months following Michael's disappearance and Professor Voss's departure, St. Ignatius Seminary experienced a series of disturbing incidents that suggested the corruption had not been entirely eliminated. Seminarians reported strange dreams involving underground chambers and dark rituals. Several students left the seminary claiming they no longer felt called to the priesthood, unable to explain their sudden change of heart. Most disturbing of all were reports of apparitions seen in the library and corridors, figures in academic robes who seemed to be searching for something or someone. Brother Timothy Morrison, whose long service to the seminary gave him authority to speak frankly with church investigators, reported that the building itself seemed to have been spiritually wounded by whatever had occurred in its depths. The atmosphere changed after that October night, he told investigators. Prayers felt harder to say, as though the air itself resisted holy words. Young men who had shown genuine vocations suddenly became troubled and uncertain. Even the older faculty members seemed nervous and distracted, as though they expected something terrible to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The basement chamber where the final ceremony had been conducted was sealed immediately after the investigation concluded, but seminary maintenance workers reported that strange sounds continued to emanate from behind the locked doors. Some claimed to hear voices speaking in unknown languages, while others described sounds that might have been scratching or digging, as though something were trying to escape from behind the stone walls. The official church response to the events at St. Ignatius was swift and decisive, but focused more on containing potential scandal than on addressing the spiritual implications of what had occurred. A team of investigators from the diocese conducted interviews with faculty and students, but their final report was classified and sealed in church archives. The public was told only that Professor Voss had been recalled to Rome and that Michael Hartwell had left the seminary to discern his vocation in private, the Seminary of Lost Souls. Completion Cardinal Francis Brennan, who oversaw the diocesan investigation, privately acknowledged that something extraordinary and disturbing had occurred at St. Ignatius, but his concern was primarily with preventing similar incidents rather than with uncovering the full extent of the corruption that had been exposed. In a confidential memorandum to Vatican officials, he wrote, "The events at St. Ignatius represent a sophisticated attempt to corrupt Catholic formation from within. We must assume that similar operations are being conducted at other institutions, and take immediate steps to identify and eliminate them before irreparable damage is done to the American Church." The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had targeted Catholic seminaries throughout North America. Over the following months, church authorities quietly removed suspicious faculty members from institutions in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. In each case, the dismissed professors had arrived with impeccable credentials that later proved to be fabricated and had focused their teaching on advanced theological concepts that gradually introduced students to practices incompatible with Catholic doctrine. The pattern was always the same. Carefully selected seminarians would be invited into exclusive study groups, isolated from their peers, through appeals to their spiritual ambition, and gradually introduced to practices that promised direct access to divine power through methods that bypassed traditional church authority. The ultimate goal appeared to be the creation of a cadre of clergy who would serve as unwitting agents of corruption within the Catholic hierarchy. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that this infiltration had been operating for decades, possibly longer. Church records revealed similar incidents dating back to the 1920s, always involving mysterious faculty members who appeared with excellent credentials, conducted specialized instruction for selected students, and disappeared when their activities attracted attention. The consistency of the pattern suggested an organized effort with resources and patience that spanned generations. Survivors, the 4 seminarians who had undergone the initial stages of Professor Voss's corruption, but survived. The final ceremony were studied extensively by church psychologists and spiritual directors. Their cases provided crucial insight into the methods used to break down and rebuild spiritual formation of future priests. Robert Chun, the seminarian from San Francisco, never fully recovered from his experiences at St. Ignatius. Despite intensive spiritual counseling and psychological treatment, he remained plagued by nightmares and an inability to participate in traditional Catholic worship. In his private journals, discovered after his death in 1978, he wrote, "The prayers I learned before Professor Voss feel hollow now, like empty shells drained of meaning. When I try to say the rosary, The words seemed to twist in my mouth, becoming something else entirely. I know that I was rescued from damnation, but I fear that part of my soul remains trapped in that basement chamber, bound to whatever darkness we were meant to serve. David Kowalski attempted to continue his priestly formation at a different seminary, but was dismissed after 6 months when faculty members noted his inability to consecrate the Eucharist properly. During his ordination practice sessions, witnesses reported that the bread would not transform, remaining ordinary matter despite the correct words and intentions. Church authorities concluded that his spiritual capacity had been fundamentally damaged by his exposure to corrupted practices, making him unsuitable for ordination, regardless of his personal desire to serve God. James Murphy and Thomas Anderson both left seminary formation entirely, unable to reconcile their calling to priesthood with the spiritual wounds they had sustained. Murphy became a teacher at a Catholic high school, finding that he could serve the church through education rather than sacramental ministry. Anderson married and raised a family, but remained deeply involved in lay ministry, as though trying to compensate for his inability to pursue the ordination he had once desired. All 4 men maintained contact throughout their lives, bound by their shared experience and their need to process trauma that they could never fully discuss with others. Their correspondence, preserved in private family archives, reveals the long-term psychological and spiritual effects of exposure to the corrupted theology that had nearly claimed their souls. The search for Michael, despite official church claims that Michael Hartwell had left voluntarily to discern his vocation elsewhere, his family never accepted this explanation. Patrick Hartwell, Michael's father, hired private investigators and contacted every Catholic institution in North America, searching for evidence of his son's whereabouts. The investigation consumed the family's resources and dominated their lives for over a decade, but produced no credible leads. The letter Michael had hidden beneath his mattress provided the only reliable account of events leading up to his disappearance, and it convinced his family that their son had died heroically defending his faith rather than abandoning his calling through cowardice. This knowledge brought them some comfort, but also deepened their determination to expose the truth about what had occurred at St. Ignatius Seminary in 1963. 10 years after Michael's disappearance, Patrick Hartwell received an anonymous letter that provided the first new information about his son's fate. The letter, postmarked from Burlington, Vermont, contained a detailed map of the mountains surrounding St. Ignatius Seminary and specific directions to a location marked with a small cross. The accompanying note read, "Your son's body rests where heroes should rest, beneath Vermont stone and sky. His sacrifice saved souls that would otherwise have been lost to darkness. Honor his memory by ensuring that others know the price of resistance to evil." Following the map's directions, Patrick Hartwell and his eldest son discovered a carefully constructed grave in a remote mountain clearing about 5 miles from the seminary. The site showed evidence of recent maintenance, suggesting that someone had been caring for it throughout the intervening years. Beneath a simple stone marker inscribed with Michael's name and the dates of his birth and disappearance, they found human remains that were later confirmed through dental records to be those of their missing son and brother. The condition of the remains suggested that Michael had died from violence rather than exposure or accident, confirming the family's belief that he had been murdered for refusing to participate in the corruption that had infected St. Ignatius Seminary. More importantly, the careful burial and ongoing maintenance of the grave indicated that someone with detailed knowledge of events had chosen to honor Michael's memory and provide his family with closure. The anonymous letters continued to arrive annually on the anniversary of Michael's disappearance, each containing information about similar incidents at Catholic institutions throughout the country. The correspondent, who never identified himself but demonstrated intimate knowledge of church operations, appeared to be conducting his own investigation into the conspiracy that had targeted American seminaries. The network exposed by 1970, the accumulated evidence from anonymous letters, church investigations, and private research had revealed the outline of a sophisticated network that had been infiltrating Catholic education for decades. The conspiracy appeared to operate through a series of shell organizations that provided fraudulent credentials for carefully trained infiltrators, backed by financial resources that enabled extended operations at multiple institutions simultaneously. Ultimate goal of this network remained unclear, but the pattern of their activities suggested an attempt to corrupt the Catholic Church from within by ensuring that future priests would be trained in practices that gradually undermine traditional doctrine and spiritual authority. The corrupted clergy would then be positioned to influence Catholic teaching and practice throughout their careers, spreading spiritual poison through seemingly legitimate ministry. The sophistication of the operation was remarkable. The infiltrators possessed extensive knowledge of Catholic theology, enabling them to introduce heretical concepts gradually and in ways that initially appeared to be developments of traditional teaching rather than departures from it. They understood seminary culture and were skilled at identifying and exploiting the spiritual ambitions of promising students. Most importantly, they had established connections within church bureaucracy that enabled them to obtain positions at prestigious institutions and to operate with apparent official sanction. Investigation revealed that the network had been active since at least the 1890s, adapting its methods to changing educational practices and church policies while maintaining consistent objectives. Some evidence suggested that it had originated in European occult societies that viewed the Catholic Church as the primary obstacle to their spiritual and political goals, making the corruption of Catholic formation a strategic priority worth. Decades of patient effort. The discovery of this network prompted a comprehensive review of faculty credentials and teaching practices at Catholic seminaries throughout North America. The investigation resulted in the quiet removal of dozens of suspicious instructors and the implementation of new verification procedures designed to prevent similar infiltration in the future. The sealed archives in 1975, Cardinal Brennan ordered that all documents related to the St. Ignatius investigation be transferred to the Vatican Secret Archives, where they were classified at the highest level of church security. The official explanation was that the materials contained information that could damage the reputation of the Catholic Church if made public, but private communications between church officials revealed deeper concerns about the spiritual implications of what had been discovered. The sealed documents included not only the investigative reports and witness testimonies, but also the materials that had been recovered from Professor Voss's abandoned quarters. These texts, written in multiple languages and containing references to practices that combined Catholic ritual with much older traditions, represented a sophisticated attempt to create a synthetic theology that would serve the purposes of whatever organization had sponsored the infiltration. Church scholars who examined these materials before they were sealed reported that they represented some of the most dangerous spiritual literature they had ever encountered. The texts were designed to appear as advanced Catholic mystical theology, while actually providing instruction and practices that would gradually separate readers from authentic Christian faith and bind them to alternative spiritual authorities. Father Marcus Whitmore, a Jesuit scholar who spent 6 months analyzing the recovered materials, wrote in his confidential report, "These documents represent a masterpiece of spiritual subversion. They use familiar Catholic terminology and reference legitimate theological concepts, but they systematically redefine these elements to serve purposes that are fundamentally opposed to Christian teaching." A seminarian studying these texts would initially believe he was learning advanced Catholic doctrine, but would gradually be led to embrace practices and beliefs that would make authentic priesthood impossible. The decision to classify these materials at the highest level of church security was made after several scholars who studied them reported experiencing spiritual distress that interfered with their ability to celebrate Mass or participate in traditional Catholic worship. Church authorities concluded that exposure to the corrupted theology, even for the purpose of scholarly analysis, posed risks that outweighed any potential benefit from continued study. Brother Morrison's final testimony. Brother Timothy Morrison continued to serve at St. Ignatius Seminary until his death in 1981, and his final years were marked by increasing concern about the spiritual condition of the institution. Despite the official cleaning and reconsecration that followed the 1953 incidents, he maintained that the building had never fully recovered from the corruption that had been introduced into its depths. In a final interview conducted by Church historians just months before his death, Brother Morrison provided the most complete account of the supernatural phenomena that had persisted at St. Ignatius for nearly 3 decades after Professor Voss's departure. His testimony, recorded but never officially released, described ongoing spiritual disturbances that suggested the corruption had not been entirely eliminated. The basement chamber was sealed, but whatever was awakened there in 1953 was never properly laid to rest, he told his interviewers. Students still report strange dreams about underground rituals and dark ceremonies. Faculty members find their lecture notes mysteriously altered, with foreign words and symbols appearing in margins they know they never wrote. Most disturbing of all are the apparitions that appear in the library, figures in academic robes who seem to be searching for something they cannot find. Brother Morrison's most significant revelation concerned the ongoing maintenance of Michael Hartwell's mountain grave. He admitted that he had been the anonymous correspondent who had guided the Hartwell family to their son's burial site and had provided them with information about similar incidents throughout the country. Young Michael died a martyr's death, defending his faith against corruption that would have claimed not only his own soul, but the souls of countless others. He explained, "His sacrifice deserves recognition, even if the Church cannot officially acknowledge what truly occurred. I have tried to honor his memory and to ensure that his death serves as a warning to those who come after." The elderly brother revealed that he had been secretly documenting incidents of suspected infiltration at Catholic institutions for over 20 years, maintaining correspondence with contacts throughout the American Church who shared his concerns about ongoing corruption. His files, discovered after his death, contained evidence of suspicious activities at dozens of seminaries, colleges, and diocesan offices, suggesting that the network exposed at St. Ignatius represented only a small portion of a much larger conspiracy. The modern legacy, the events at St. Ignatius Seminary, had profound effects on Catholic formation practices that continue to influence seminary education today. The verification procedures implemented in response to the infiltration discovery have prevented similar large-scale corruption, but Church authorities remain vigilant for signs of more subtle attempts to influence Catholic teaching and practice. Basement chamber beneath the St. Ignatius Library remains sealed, and the seminary itself was quietly closed in 1985 when enrollment dropped to unsustainable levels. The building was eventually sold to a private foundation that converted it into a retreat center, but the new owners reported ongoing difficulties with the property that led to its abandonment. Within 5 years, local residents in the Vermont mountains around the former seminary site continue to report unusual phenomena, particularly during the month of October. Hikers describe encounters with figures in academic robes who seem to be searching for something in the forest. Campers tell of hearing voices speaking in unknown languages and of finding strange symbols carved into trees along the mountain trails. Michael Hartwell's grave remains well maintained, though no one claims responsibility for its care. Fresh flowers appear regularly, and the simple stone marker has been supplemented by a more elaborate memorial that identifies him as a defender of the faith who died protecting others from spiritual corruption. The Hartwell family established a foundation dedicated to investigating cases of suspected infiltration or corruption within Catholic institutions. working quietly with church authorities. The foundation has helped identify and address dozens of incidents involving suspicious faculty members or unusual teaching practices that echo the patterns discovered at St. Ignatius Seminary. Epilogue. The eternal vigil in the end. The story of St. Ignatius Seminary serves as both warning and inspiration for those who understand that the battle between good and evil extends far beyond the political and social conflicts that dominate public attention. The corruption that nearly claimed Michael Hartwell and his fellow seminarians represents a form of warfare that targets the very foundations of faith, seeking to transform servants of light into agents of darkness through carefully crafted deception and gradual spiritual poisoning. Michael's heroic refusal to surrender his soul, even at the cost of his life, stands as a testament to the power of authentic faith when confronted with sophisticated evil. His sacrifice saved not only his own soul, but potentially countless others who would have fallen victim to the corrupted clergy that Professor Voss and his associates sought to create. The vigilance of individuals like Brother Morrison, who dedicated his life to identifying and opposing such corruption, demonstrates that ordinary people can play crucial roles in defending their communities against spiritual threats that institutional authorities might overlook or minimize. The anonymous letters and careful documentation that he maintained for decades ensured that Michael's sacrifice was not forgotten and that future attempts at infiltration would be recognized and resisted. The ongoing spiritual disturbances at the former seminary site remind us that some battles leave permanent scars on the physical world, and that places where great evil has been attempted may never fully recover their original innocence. The sealed basement chamber and the abandoned building itself serve as monuments to the reality of supernatural evil and the price that must be paid to resist it. But perhaps most importantly, the story of St. Ignatius Seminary illustrates the paradoxical truth that even the most sophisticated attempts to corrupt faith ultimately strengthen it by forcing believers to clarify and defend the principles they hold most dear. Michael Hartwell's clarity of vision in his final moments, when he chose martyrdom over spiritual compromise, represents the kind of heroic witness that transforms tragedy into triumph and darkness into light. The conspiracy that targeted American seminaries in the mid-20th century was eventually defeated not by institutional investigation or official church action, but by the faithful response of individuals who recognized evil when they encountered it and chose to resist regardless of the personal cost. Their example continues to inspire those who face similar challenges in their own time, reminding us that the most important battles are often fought not in public, but in the hidden chambers of the human heart, where each soul must choose between light and darkness, truth and deception, courage and compromise. In the mountains of Vermont, where autumn mists still shroud the abandoned buildings of St. Ignatius Seminary, Michael Hartwell's grave stands as a reminder that some victories can only be achieved through sacrifice, and that the price of defending faith against sophisticated corruption may be higher than we imagine, but is always worth paying. His story continues to inspire those who understand that the battle for human souls never ends, and that each generation must be prepared to recognize evil in whatever forms it chooses to wear, and to resist it with the same heroic faith that Michael demonstrated in his final hour. The Seminary of Lost Souls reminds us that in the war between good and evil, there are no neutral parties and no safe spectators. Every person must choose which master they will serve, and those choices have consequences that extend far beyond individual lives to affect the spiritual condition of entire communities and institutions. Michael Hartwell chose well, and his sacrifice continues to protect others from the darkness that once threatened to consume St. Ignatius Seminary and spread throughout the American Catholic Church. In remembering his story, we honor not only his heroic witness, but also the eternal vigilance required to protect faith from those who would corrupt it from within. The Seminary of Lost Souls teaches us that the greatest threats to spiritual truth often come disguised as academic advancement and theological sophistication, and that the ability to recognize and resist such deceptions is one of the most important gifts that authentic faith can provide. May Michael Hartwell's example inspire future generations to choose truth over convenience, courage over safety, and faith over the countless forms of spiritual compromise that will always tempt those who seek to serve God in a world where darkness masquerades as light and evil presents itself as the highest form of wisdom.